for it. So I think the first thing I would love to do now that I can confirm we're recording, is I would love if you could introduce yourself, the work that you do, and maybe if you just want to share slightly more like personal fun fact details as well. That'd be awesome for our listeners.
Certainly. David Makin, I'm an associate professor at Washington State University. I also serve as the undergraduate director in my department, which is criminology and criminal justice. And I guess most central to our conversation here, I'm the director of the Complex Social Interactions Lab at Washington State University. So by and large, and certainly we'll talk a little bit more about this, the purpose of the lab is really to help police departments make sense, what we would consider to kind of operationalize their footage. Right? So you figure most departments amass just tremendous repositories of footage, and they don't do anything with it. They don't review it. Very rarely is it used for evidentiary purposes. In a criminal complaint or criminal case, it just kind of sits there, and then eventually it's deleted because it no longer needs to be retained. We kind of call it falls off the water cliff, right? A waterfall. It just disappears. And what we realize is if we could help agencies think about this data, we're not this footage as data, not just footage, right? Not just something that you watch and you review, maybe if someone complains, but really think about how can you integrate this into your workflow, right? Your supervisory workflow when you're training officers, really to make it data. And, I guess it's an interesting kind of, I don't know, it's a story to kind of go with this. It emerged around Thanksgiving was the idea for this. I know, a weird thing, it's, Thanksgiving, you got the turkey in, you're doing all your thing, you're waiting. And my research partner, one of my best friends, Dr. Dale Willits, who's also in the department, we're just kind of complaining about, rather, I was complaining that, there's all this training that police, are required, and, it feels like everyone's trying to sell them training. We'll train you on this. And we've got this new training over here. And yet when you ask, what's the efficacy or the effectiveness of that training? Does it change how an officer approaches interactions? We don't have a lot of evidence around that. And when you think about, in some larger departments, they might spend $1 million, $2 million to buy kind of a bucket of training. And you go, does it actually work? And we started just talking more about this idea. And I said, I've got a bunch of agencies that I've worked with over the years that would be interested in working. I like really put in the arduous task of saying, we're going to make something of this footage. We're gonna make it data, and we're gonna use it. And he just said, why don't you just do it? Right? Like, why don't we do it? Why don't we just create this thing? And WSU had what was called the grand challenges, right? This idea that, we can solve big issues, right? Like, and these are really lofty, right? Like inequity, right? Like, how do you solve inequity, right? Climate change, nuclear, like they're like really big, these grand, I mean, if you're gonna go big, right? Grand challenges. And we said we could do it. And we were one of the few faculty to win one of these awards, and essentially it funded the creation of the lab. We started working with industry partners. And the next thing we know, we had a full lab. Next thing we knew, fast forward, I think we're maybe 4 or 5 years now, we've had the lab. We have 6 police departments that we work with. And it all, started around, a typical conversation at Thanksgiving around what if we could answer some of these complex questions, if we could, help agencies really use this data, because that's what it is. So that little nudge was all it took. So I tell people, you can solve a lot of problems just bringing them up at Thanksgiving.
Awesome. I feel like the tryptophan and the turkey is definitely good for putting you to sleep, but also driving a little bit of those extra brain waves. So
It's those neurons firing in the right way. You're talking a little bit about work, but you're not trying to, right? Like you've got people staring at you.
it's when you get the best ideas for sure. All right. Well, so you kind of talked about your process of how Washington State University and you as a faculty member came to taking on this grant. I was interested in hearing a little bit of how, if any, like students were involved in that process. I know that I think the way that we came across your office or your lab was through I guess I think it was a Washington State news source written by students talking about how folks really wanted to see a partnership between students and WazU regarding policing and how what data they can provide to change the relationship on campus. And so I was wondering if there was a connection between your work or a connection between any of that student advocacy.
Absolutely. I'm first and foremost, the lab, is really dependent on students working with us. I mean, so as of right now, work with about 130 undergraduate research assistants. I mean, it really is about, helping students, learn how to think scientifically, right? So really approaches as a research data, right? So it's not just we're observing, we're essentially coding data. We're thinking about it objectively, right? It's not how well do you think, an officer did, right? It's really about objectively, what did the officer do or not do in this interaction? And so what we tend to see in the lab is, pre-COVID, we generally had about 20 to 25 students that would be working in the lab, right? And so they take credit and we teach them the process, again, how to think about this as data. And we tend to see a split focus. We tend to see, students that, very diverse, right? So we have, of course, criminology and criminal justice students are always interested in this. We have psych students. We've had engineering students, right? Like we get a really diverse set of students that, really their goal is really, graduate school, right? And so you get 120 hours of lab time, which is great, right? So you have students that are struggling to meet their lab hours for grad applications. It's like, you come work in the lab, you're going to get 120 hours if you do a 3 credit course. The other side is really, these are future police officers. And what they are so passionate about policing, but they also want to really learn, right? Like this is an opportunity for them to, certainly learn the research side. But you think about how many hours they're going to watch footage. There's a lot of ride-alongs, right? Like you think of how many ride-alongs can you really coordinate. It's like, you know what, come on down. And, you can get like 120 hours of ride-alongs, right? Where, you get to watch officers in a variety of situations. And, we have, different projects that are ongoing and they fluctuate, semester to semester. Always kind of comes back to use of force. We've been building a very large use of force data set. But really, again, it's involving those undergraduate students because they're the coders, right? Like we sit through and we really thought about how to build out this, this new instrument because no one had ever really there isn't one, right? There's no real validated instrument for, how do you objectively think about police interactions and break it down so you can control, everything everything that occurs, when it occurs. We had to develop a new methodology that we actually published, which was not just thinking about it as did it occur. It was really about thinking about when did it occur, how long did it occur, and what it does is it gives you a complete timeline of interaction. And so while we're developing a new methodology, we published it, and we've got other people now that are using it when they think about these data. Um, we have this great code book, right, that we built with our research partners and our departments. But all of this really depends on students, right? They really are part and parcel of this research, right? Like it's not our ideas. Yeah, they're there, but it's without having those undergraduate students and graduate students that work with these data that push back a little bit and go, why don't you collect this? And it's like, well, because that's a perceptions question, right? Like that's interesting, right? But it's not what we need for this data, right? Like how well you think they handled that is interesting. And we want you to give us that information, but it has to go here, right? So we actually have a note process that we use where students can put in there how well, we look at that data, because then we have a really interesting measure, which we can go, how did, these coders, so we have inter-rater reliability. So you have, multiple coders all watching the same video independently, and you compare everything to see, how consistent they are or kind of aligned they are. But that's their perception data, which we keep completely separate from objectively what occurred or did not occur.
I know you said this earlier, but what is contact social interaction? Because I have never heard of that before. And are like there academic fields that intersect within this topic, or is it specific to CSU or within? Yeah.
No, that's a great question. So the idea was that, we tend to think of interactions as they just kind of happen, right? Sometimes you'll hear people talk about, benign interactions. Nothing really happens in them. And when you think more about it, the question is the counterfactual: why? Why did nothing, right? Like, you look at something, you go, why did it not go sideways, if you will, right? Like, why did it stay on this course? And the reality of policing is that they are always inherently complex, right? You have to navigate, you're working with another person, right? So this is that interpersonal communication. And at the same time, you have other actors that might be there, right? So you have bystanders, you have potentially a victim, you might have other officers that arrive, because by and large, it's, other officers do show up. And the vast majority of our interactions that we look at some point, another officer adds themselves to that interaction. So all of a sudden, they become complex, right? It's not just managing this one person and having this communication and trying to resolve this. And it might be an arrestable offense, right? But you have all these other actors and factors that are kind of contributing to that interaction. And then you add in, time on shift. Is this the officer's first call out? Is it potentially their last call out? Have they been on shift for 3 full days, right? So, what type of shift? Are they on graveyard? How many hours have they now consecutively worked? All of that starts to factor in, and that can influence decision making. And so for us, this is really an interdisciplinary research lab. You look at the website. We have a communication expert, right? We have an expert in math, right? So because a lot of what we do is computationally heavy. Well, because you need that. You need a truly interdisciplinary team, because this isn't something that one discipline has all the theories and the foundations to be able to answer. Policing in and of itself is inherently multidisciplinary. And really the only way that you're going to improve policing is to think about it from a very interdisciplinary perspective. So great question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for helping us with that definition a little bit. I guess my next question is, are there any particularly interesting research findings or patterns that you've noticed so far in the data set? Maybe just, I guess in general, what are some of those like big points that you feel like you can share with departments, or maybe that when you have undergraduate students coming in to start some research, that you kind of can give them a gist, like, okay, this is kind of what we have been looking at so far.
So we've been really interested in, emotionality, right? So we published a few papers that are all freely available. We always, they're on ResearchGate and Google Scholar. We always get them up there as quick as possible. But really, how to maintain kind of this kind of neutral, effective state, right? And you do see that pattern, right? When it's not so much what this other person, right? So this other person, they're in this effective state. They're frustrated with the situation. Of course, they're frustrated, right? But a lot of what we've seen is how critical it is for an officer not to reciprocate, because it really does escalate, and you can see it. We publish on. You can see it in the data that when an officer starts kind of reflecting this, and they start getting, in these affective states, right? all of a sudden it just escalates and it just starts to increase. And most people go, well, of course, right? Like if you respond in kind, like you think about any interaction, you've ever had an argument with, a partner, right? And the very moment you raise your voice, they probably might raise their voice. Except in those situations where you have a partner that's like, no, we don't do that in our relationship, right? Like they just stop it right there, which is also a really great technique. You set the boundaries, like, no, we're not going to speak to each other this way, right? But most people go, well, of course that happens. You know what it's like to be a scientist and see it in your data? Like your data, it's like, why would you test that? It's like, that's what we do in science, right? Like we test assumptions. If you assume that this is what happens, we got to see it in our data. So that's one incredibly, it's like, oh, but now we know it, right? We can see it. The challenge is how, what are the factors that impede an officer's ability to essentially regulate their emotional state, right? To not respond in kind, because it's very much in our human nature to do that. Someone raises their voice to you, you start to raise your voice to them, right? Like the way they start to speak to you, you might respond in that way. And then the more stressed you get, it really loosens your ability to regulate. Well, we want to now know, what are the factors that contribute? Is it certain interactions, certain people, potentially, right? What are those factors that really loosen an officer's ability? We know that when we become highly stressed, or we're under these stress states, we tend to fall back to pre-established scripts. And this is a matter of what works. It's not if it's right or wrong. It's like, I know that when I do this, it tends to work. It might not be, might be a poor practice, right? But inevitably, it's about what works. And so for us, that's something we like to share with students is, really, take note of that. And that students often notice patterns that we talk about that we're trying to explore now. And so I'll give you one of those is like when certain officers show up, right? There's, they watch enough of the data, they learn a lot about, how different officers interact in situations. And it's kind of like, we always hear this from officers. It's like when so-and-so shows up, you really got to be mindful, right? Because they kind of take this approach. It's like, oh, officer so-and-so. You do see that sometimes where certain officers will show up and it just throws the dynamic completely out of balance, right? Well, then it's a matter of why, right? So this is really just a series of whys, right? It's like you find these patterns and you go, why? And then you chase down those patterns and you ask the same question, why? We just finished a project, at least the data collection portion, on COVID contacts. So that, I think that was particularly interesting. We don't have results yet because the data was it's been fully validated, at least as of this week, it'll get fully validated. But that's, we were requested by a department. They wanted to understand how their officers were engaging those interactions. Were they, explaining the law appropriately? Were they dismissing the law, right? Like, it's just go do it inside, right? Like, just, you can't do it out here, but if you go in there, we don't really care, right? Like, I wanted to understand how were they, explaining the law, right? Like why they were doing what they were doing. Were they wearing PPE? Were they offering people that they were interacting with PPE? How did did they accept it? They go, I don't want that, or I'm not wearing that. And so we had an agency chief that said, I really want to understand what these contexts look like, because the reality is that, we're likely to experience another pandemic in the future, and we'd like to be better prepared. And we'd also like to learn how to relay public health ordinances and that information, because that's our job. And so I was very, it was kind of, that's one of those things that becomes very inspiring when you work with agencies in the way that we do on really what are agency-driven questions. And when they give those questions to you and they say, I'd like to know more about this. I'd like to know what one-on-one interactions look like. Could you study one-on-one interactions and let me know, for example, like what incivility looks like, right? Like just one officer, one, citizen, how often are they, swearing at each other, right? How often are they interrupting each other? Using slurs or these kind of different dimensions of incivility. And they come from agencies. And that's what I think makes it more meaningful. And students, at least thus far, seem to resonate with them when they realize we're not working to answer, me or Dr. Willits or any of the other, researchers attached our questions. It's really about agency-driven questions. What do they want to learn? And then we build, a data collection around that.
Awesome. So it seems like your project you're currently working on isn't over yet, but what have been some of the findings of your past research, specifically how they intersect with the question of how do students and people of color interact with police?
So I think some of what we've been able to publish on, really looked at variability and the timing of force. So that was some of our early researchers really focused. And again, a lot of this, not even a lot of this, most all of this comes back to the timing. The timing of when things happen is incredibly important. And so in terms of, variability based on, being a student of color or a community member of color, one of the agencies that, we were working on analyzing their use of force for them, we did detect, that they were not more likely to use force, but they were quicker, their officers were quicker in their decision to use force. And when we turn those results over to this agency, this is what I mean by that, the inspiration, right? When an agency, chief looks at that and goes, I want to know why my officers are quicker in using force against these members, of our community. Why? So in so much as we have why questions, they have why, because they want to understand what's driving this, the incivility. And so that's one of the projects. So some of this is really about, you got to build a large enough data set, right? So, when you've looked at 100 interactions, right? It may or may not be generalizable to that agency, right? Depends on, how large the population is, right? All that, the science behind it, right? But it's really about building a larger data set, right? That you continue to take random samples of these departments and you keep analyzing them and you keep building this data set. And then you get to a level you're comfortable with to say, across these, 6 agencies controlling for all of these different, variables, we do see that there's some variation based on some dimension, right? Be it their race, their gender, location, the type of call. And that's incredibly powerful, right? To be able to show empirically. And then it's, what do you do with that data, right? So if you go back and, you imagine that maybe one of the reasons that force is used earlier is because, there's something about the emotionality is higher in those interactions, and they seem to start higher, right? So it's not that it kind of peaks, 75% of the interaction. It's like in the first 10% of the interaction, it's already emotionally higher. Right? There's a higher level of intensity. Right? And you think about, well, how do we detect that? Right? So maybe think about the decibel levels, right? The vocal tone, right? Like you're pulling out all of these factors. Okay, then the question is, again, the big one, the why, right? Why do they start higher, right? And then you can think about, well, let's think about the words that are used, right? So now you think about transcribing, analyzing, and thinking about using NLP and other types of techniques where you can start to extract more information out to really contextualize that interaction to say, well, it appears to be this. And then again, it's a matter of what do you do with the knowledge when you have it. For us, I think that's what's incredibly helpful in getting agencies to work with us, is that they realize that we're going to be able to help them answer the why. And when we answer the why, what they get is, well, do we need to do a training refresher? Yes, right? Do we need to, start having conversations with our, officers about, incivility? Like, we don't swear at people ever, right? And it might be that we don't use profanity. And I've heard pushback, right? We're like, we just swear. We were trying to develop a project with the NYPD, and we're kind of walking through this, and they said, we just swear. It's just what we do. It's who we are. And I said, there's a difference, and that's, we don't code for profanity unless you want. We code for directed profanity, right? Because there's a real difference in that, like oh shit, right? Like, is what it is, right? Different is why you gotta be an asshole. See what I mean? Like, there's a difference there. And we've had agencies, that they did a little pushback till we explain it and said, see the difference there? We code for the directed because that's untenable, right? Like, when you are, an officer, you're a public servant, you don't do that. It's just, you don't. Not right. There's no justification, rationalization for doing that, right? Now, I get that you might, it's just how we communicate. So we might swear a little bit just to get our feelings out there. But that's unacceptable. We wouldn't tolerate it if a school teacher, right? It's like, why are you an asshole, right? Like, we would all go, nope, that's a non-starter. But yet we've had pushback from agencies. They're like, that's okay in certain contexts. And we go, sure. I mean, if your policy is what it is, we're just going to, again, code your footage, convert it to data, and make it it's all objective. It's, did this thing happen? Did this event happen? When did it occur and how long did it occur? And then we'll give you back, a general, here's what your baseline looks like. Here's how many of your interactions on average has this variable that we're interested in. As of right now, we code a little over 130 different events. And again, it's just a matter of if, when, and how long.
And would you say that overall, would you say that the response to your research changes once agencies get maybe more information about their role and their footage in particular? Have you noticed a difference in that?
Absolutely. I think for us, I remember the first, I'm a big coffee person. So I tend to pre-COVID, we would do meetings over coffee, right? We'd travel wherever we need to travel, we'd sit down, we'd have coffee. And, once they realize that we're not looking to, to solve answer our research questions, right? It's really about what do you want to learn from your data? And I think sometimes it's a bit much because they go, we haven't really thought about it. It's like, well, what could you tell us? I'm like, tell you anything you want. Well, here's what we do. We walk them through. We have these code books, and we say, this is all of what we currently extract from your footage. What do you want to know? And it's not captured in there. We'll build a supplemental code book, and we'll add it to our data, our workflow, and we'll extract it from the footage. And that has been the buy-in. That's what gets it right there, is when they realize that even if we don't collect that data, it is, we could collect it for them. And I think most agencies, it's always kind of the same thing. It's like, hey, we'd like to analyze all our use of force, really want to understand, how we're using force, right? How quickly are our officers, does it vary by shift, right? Really thinking about, you just build an agency baseline. And I think that's how we have to really kind of explain it. It's like, if you can build an agency baseline, then you can build shift baselines, right? So you can imagine how quickly in an interaction does an officer use force in general in your agency, then on these different shifts. And now they've got something actionable, right? Then you can think about it, certain contact types, right? So is it a mental health call, right? Is it, a call in a certain neighborhood? Is it a call with someone that we've had interactions with before? And then you start, here's your baseline, and then you can start to see where these different groups fall in relation to that baseline. And that's actionable. But it really goes back to, what does the agency really want to learn? Other agencies will, procedural justice really, really critical in policing, right? It's all about how you speak to people. How do you explain? Do you tell them, the reason for the stop? Do you tell them who you are? Do you ask who, right? Like, do you say, seek some confirmation that you're talking to, the correct person? So these objectively, there's these kind of domains that we can extract, and we do extract. And for many agencies, that's what they want to know. How procedurally just are their interactions? And when you can show them, that, well, by and large, you all are hitting your target, right? It's like the majority of the interactions are. However, your officers are not introducing themselves. They're not explaining why they're interacting with a person. They're not, your policy states that, they must tell the person that they're recording them, um, you know, before they effect an arrest. That happens 10% of the time. That's a training refresher. That's like, hey, look, that you're required to tell people and you're not. So again, it's just about building baselines and then developing what are actionable plans based on those.
Great, thank you. And I don't want to keep you too long, so I think to kind of wrap up this discussion, I want to maybe bring it back to the campus level again. And then wanted to ask, how has this program worked with Wazoo's campus police, or I don't know if you have campus police or you feel like local police for Wazoo, but how has that changed? Have you seen a way that it's changed the way that they interact with students? And especially maybe in the last year with, I think COVID really complicated how, police are taking calls to parties where no one's wearing masks. And on top of that, I think the national pressure following the death of George Floyd. So I guess, have you noticed changes in that relationship, and maybe have they like intensified, have they gotten better, more complex, I guess, over this past year?
No, I would love to be able to answer that, but I also have to state the lab was closed because of COVID. So we were able to open up in the spring with a handful of students. And I don't have the data to answer that. I know that's one of those things where when you go from 25, students to 0 students to, like 5 or 6, it gets very, very limited on the data. I think we were able to get up. I think we had 7 or 8. It's just minimal processing of data.
I can
But
imagine.
hopefully, come fall, fingers crossed, we're all back. We're having that campus experience. We're back as close as, what we can get pre-COVID. We'll hopefully process enough data. We are working with the Washington State University Police Department to onboard that agency so that we would be able to analyze their body-worn camera footage to, again, get back at some of those core questions. They're particularly interested in, how their officers are approaching from a procedurally just perspective, as well as learning about, de-escalation. And I think that is arguably one of the most important, really, research programs that needs to be truly accomplished in policing. We write a lot about de-escalation. We offer a tremendous amount about why every agency officer needs to be trained on de-escalation, and they need to apply de-escalation, and agencies have de-escalation first policies. And yet when you ask someone objectively, what is de-escalation? How do you do it? You get different answers from everybody. Right? They're like, oh, well, you just de-escalate. Okay, well, objectively tell me, what would it look like if you were training someone to do it? Well, it varies by person, it varies by context. That's complex, right? What we're trying to do is really understand it. So we have a variety of grant applications out right now, which we'd argue be one of the first attempts to really see the application of de-escalation and try to build really what we'd like to believe is a valid instrument around what does it objectively look like put in practice. Because when you can study the techniques that are used, then you can also analyze to what extent do they, have an influence on mediating, someone's affective state. That, I think, is, something we continue to struggle with, because you really need to see what it looks like in practice. And I've seen a lot of techniques, and we've analyzed well over 15,000 hours of body cam footage. And at the same point, we've seen a variety of techniques, and some techniques you would swear would work, and for whatever reason, in certain circumstances, they don't.
Mhm.
Well, the more we analyze, the more data we have, the more, we're able to offer some evidence that, these techniques do work, but they work in these contexts.
Mhm.
Or in others, this works. Or you notice when this is used, it's actually probably one of the most effective techniques. And that's what we're trying to do. I do believe that procedural justice is often argued as a type of kind of non-escalatory practice. And I do think that it's incredibly important, that when you interact with someone, you should tell them who you are. You should confirm if you're speaking to the right person. You should explain, state, here's why I'm interacting with you. Take time to explain why I'm interacting with you, to seek your input, right? Like have a conversation around, do we agree? Do we disagree? Right? To explain what's going to happen. It's an interaction, right? It's interactional by its very nature. But having a little bit of that transparency at the front end, I would argue, is incredibly important. We spend so much time thinking about de-escalation as opposed to thinking about what if we just have these non-escalatory practices, right? Like, what are those core techniques? If we just do those things I mentioned, does it tend to maintain a calmer interaction overall? I think across what we've seen, I believe it does. We just need a larger data set to be much more confident. But then at the same point, shouldn't all interactions be like that? Right? Like, shouldn't every interaction with a law enforcement officer make certain that they tell you who they are? Right? They confirm that they're talking to the right person. They tell you why I'm in, right? That should just happen automatically. And
Mhm.
yet we do know in policing that it doesn't always occur. That sometimes you skip some steps, and that with certain groups, they tend to skip a lot more steps than others. And that's untenable. So again, if you think about this as data, objective data, to go back to one of those earlier questions, if you do see variability, based on, community members of color, do they tend to skip certain steps along the way? And the answer should be that no, everyone is treated with equity and equally.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for that overview. And it sounds like very helpful data to be collecting. But I think once folks are talking about perceptions too, I'm sure separating those variables out from something that's very data statistically observable. And then I think that's where you get to maybe the more the psychology side of these interactions too, I can imagine is a huge challenge.
That is our coming, well, one of my summer projects is we did take all that perceptions data, and they're all on Likert scales. And so we're connecting that to the objective data. So now this will be our first, we tend to avoid perceptions, but this will be our first perceptions study where we're looking at, variation on what objectively happens, and then connecting that with perceptions and thinking about implicit bias. And so, we were able to get about 20 participants that watched 70 use of force videos. They all watch the same use of force videos.
Mhm.
And then we have implicit bias and a variety of different, so we have gender, we have implicit, and there's a few others. So race, implicit bias, and gender, and there's a few others that we have. And so we're
Mhm.
going to be able to look at how, all of these kind of come together, right, to influence our perceptions of an interaction. So that's our summer project.
Awesome. And it sounds like you definitely had some students who were like, well, we got to do perception. We have to look into this a little bit.
You do want to know. I
Yeah.
like, you can see that in, any of these videos, right, that are out there. People watch them and you see them walk away with the officer did everything correct or they were horrible. And we've even, sat down with, supervisors all the way up to chiefs, and they're all watching the same video. And some will say, that was within policy. And they're like, actually, I think that was out of policy.
Mhm.
You go, huh? Like, y'all watch the same thing, right? Like, and you see, and that's, that led to, a variety of projects that we worked on with the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins, some funded research by the Department of Homeland Security. their science and technology director around perception, like, we know factors that contribute to how people can see the same video and see different things in it.
Mhm.
So really thinking about it from a more technical, so frame rates, right? Like really the technical aspects of the video, and can that influence our perceptions? And that's a whole new body of research, right? Again, it's not just what we're seeing, it's kind of what's informing what we see, right? That we're filtering it through these different lenses. And those lenses, do you have someone in law enforcement, right? Have you heard their stories? Um, you know, does that influence how you interpret in interactions?
Mhm.
So all of that, is incredibly important. Those perceptions matter. We just have to keep them on a separate instrument. We need you to think objectively first, and then you can add in those perceptions, and we can look at them later and we can talk about them. And that's what I think one of the more interesting parts of all this is that, having our students be able, our coders that work with us, have those note fields, right? Have that journaling activity where they get to write about what they're feeling as they watch these interactions, that we can work with them and, and quickly identify when they're, getting a little bit desensitized. They watch a little too many use of force videos. And it's like, okay, well, you know what? We've got some really great, traffic stops, right? Like they are benign. They're not like the traffic stops we think. They're like really, really boring, right? It's like, okay, here it is. You were speeding. You're like, yep, I was speeding. I know I was. Like,
Yeah.
and we can rotate. And you gotta learn from that.
Mhm.
Because again, we're right now it's manual human coding. Now, eventually, our goal is to automate a lot of this, to leverage really machine learning to extract more and more data out of these.
Mhm.
But before we do that, we really need to understand what to pull out of these videos.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people in this space right now that are just doing the automated approach. And there's a lot, at least from what we've learned, there's a lot of contextual information. If you don't collect that, it's
Mhm.
going to tell you an incorrect picture. It's not even going to be it's not even going to be hate, and it's just going to be wrong, factually wrong, because you're missing all these other variables that are so critical.
Mhm.
We do that because it's the lowest common, right? It's like, hey, if I can extract this word, right? It's like, yeah, but that's not directed, right? Yeah, they're cussing, and maybe that profanity is something the agency's interested in, but
Mhm.
you got to be able to help them answer the question, not, run this automated workflow and go, here's how often this occurs. Like, I want to know when it occurs. I want to know why it occurs. And a
Mhm.
lot of these automated tools that people are selling to agencies aren't leading them to the why, right? They're just giving them this score, and they go, okay, we analyze our footage. Um, and that's a disservice. You need to really make this a part of your workflow, part of your supervision process, a part of your training process. Everybody wants to, to learn to be better at what they do. And at least the agencies where we work with, we're confident to say that they all want to be better. And it's not to say they're poor agencies, right? It's like, could we be better? Could we be more? And they're striving towards that by using this data. Again, it's not footage, it's data, and they're using it as data.
Thank you for that insight. I think that is a really important discussion to be having too. I think you're very right when you say like I see a lot of like de-escalation. We're gonna collect data on use of force, and then it does make you wonder, okay, but how is that going to connect to training? How is that going to connect to real impact? So I definitely appreciate the work that your lab is doing and you and your fellow researchers are doing with trying to distinguish some of these whys and set up all of these varying variables that might show some patterns about how police are going to be interacting with community members. And it's really interesting to see how that conversation kind of trickles down to campuses too, because they're definitely like a flashpoint for political activism. And so it's very cool that Wazoo has that research side as well. I think that's something that Western, being a much smaller school, we don't have that much research happening on our campus that we can refer to or reach out to and say, hey, do you know what's going on here? Can you help us apply some of these questions we have to maybe our campus specific issues? So I really appreciate it. I feel like I picked up a lot of insights from this conversation.
No, happy to do so. Remember, there's always research help available, right? So there's always research being done. It's just a matter of to reach out and ask for assistance. I think that's, we tend not to go to these departments. They most often come to us. They learn about us and ask, could we help? And I always, always trying to encourage anyone, right? I think we're out here. There's lots of people doing this research. And their research program might not be specific to what you want to learn, but they might be able to counsel you, guide you in the way so that you can do it. And again, research is all about, right, these steps, right? It's the method, it's a scientific method. And once you teach people that, in the limits of what you can and cannot do, you do your own research. Go out there, you do you. I work with a lot of undergrad students that have really interesting ideas. And they always start with, I don't think I could do that. It's like, no, let's learn the process, and you absolutely can do that.
Awesome. Well, I want to be mindful of time. It looks like we're about to hit 9 a.m. Those are all of my questions. If you had any kind of like final questions or insights that you wanted to share, of course, you are welcome.
No, I think I've given you probably more than your audience needed. Again, you give a researcher an hour of the time, they'll take 2 because we love what we do. This has been, honestly a privilege to be able to work with agencies that trust us enough to give us access to this footage. So I think a lot of it is really on the departments. I think we tend to be very critical of departments, and we should absolutely be so, right? Like, we need to hold them to be accountable and transparent. We also need to acknowledge that there are many progressive departments that are willing, to share in releasing data. In our case, footage of what their officers are doing. And sometimes we find things that are indefensible, and we have to share them, that these types of, this is what we're seeing in your data. And thus far, every agency, every chief, trainer, field training officer, they always want to know why. Right? I was like, okay, well, what do we do about it now? And for me, I think that's what your audience needs to know, is that there are departments that are out there. They are very progressive, and they are doing everything that they can do to become better. And so we have to acknowledge that.
For sure. And it definitely helps to have labs and researchers who are kind of here to help fill in that gap of we see you asking why, we can help. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. Ada had to hop off for another meeting, but she also wanted to pass along her thanks as well. I'll definitely send you the link when this episode is up. We're thinking probably around next Monday or Tuesday. We'll have it all pieced together.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really going to make it a much more, I think, exciting episode than me and Ada just talking about our opinions and thoughts and our Google Scholar abstracts that we are reading. So I really appreciate
those
it.
are still fun,
They are very helpful.
And then again, I think if anything, bring in, those researchers, I worked with an undergrad student. It was one of my bucket list items as an academic was to publish with an undergrad student. And I did that. It was one of my first ones. It was out of the lab. So when you do those Google Scholar abstracts, you're talking about them, reach out to those researchers. Say, hey, I'd love to, spend 10 minutes, just picking your brain a little bit on our podcast. I'd imagine that the vast majority would say yes. They'd figure out a way. Because again, we love to talk about our research and what we do. Clearly, we're passionate about what we do. And so just getting it out there. Translate, what you're doing is translational science, taking all the science that we do and making it and translating it to the public. Because at the end of the day, this is really all for them, right? Like, this is to just create better knowledge so that we, have better understanding about what's happening in the world and why it happens the way it does.
Absolutely. And well, that's our goal with our podcast. So we hope that we're taking some big ideas and drilling them down so that students, on their way to work or wherever can maybe tune in and be like, oh, okay, this is what people on our campus are talking about. Ada and I are also definitely the political science research nerds. And so we're always the ones in our office. We're like, yeah, let's go read this paper, reach out to a researcher, talk to some academics, and we have to have our office members remind us like it's okay, like you don't have to turn this into your undergraduate paper, just go interview someone, have fun with it, make it digestible for our students. So it's been a great project, and definitely interviews like this make the difference for us.
Well, it was my pleasure. So thank you for having me.
For sure. Well, go ahead and hop off. Looks like you've got some sun over on your side of the state. So hope you're enjoying that. We just went from like a great weather in Western Washington back to our rainy normal. But have a great rest of your day.
You do the same.
Take care.